Hello, this is Dr. DeMaio, and this is the upper extremity of the appendicular skeleton. This would be your osteology of the upper extremity. Includes the pectoral girdle and the upper extremity. So pectoral girdle is kind of like what is that? Is that a girdle you wear? No, it's kind of like the pectoral fins of a fish. And then you also will have pelvic girdle when we do the pelvis and the lower extremity, but for the upper extremity, the arms and hands are attached to the pectoral girdle, right? And that's what we're covering. If you only knew what I do before making these recordings, like me, la, 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 la. We got to lighten it up a little bit. Okay, so let's go. So the appendicular skeleton means everything other than the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton included 80 bones. That included the skull, which has the cranial and facial bones, the spine, the sternum, the ribs, and even the ossicles of the ears were included, the 3 tiny bones inside each ear. And they include the hyoid bone, which is not attached to the skeleton. It's attached to muscles, the muscles of swallowing. But the appendicular skeleton is everything else. That includes your pectoral, pelvic girdles, your upper extremities, and your lower extremities. So it's made up of bones of the limbs and the girdles. And we know the pectoral girdle is attached to the upper limbs to the body, and the pelvic girdle secures the lower limbs. This conversation, or this little recording today, is going to be focused on the upper extremity and the pectoral girdle. So pectoral or shoulder girdles, you can call it. And the pectoral girdles consist of on the anterior side, we have your 2 clavicles, which are your collarbones. And on the posterior side, the 2 scapula, or shoulder blades. They attach the upper limbs to the axial skeleton in a manner that allows for maximum movement. They provide attachment points, this is important, for muscles that move the upper limbs. As a matter of fact, the entire upper extremity is really only anchored at the sternoclavicular joint to the thorax. So you have the upper extremity, the whole arm, forearm, the wrist, the hands, the fingers, and the clavicle attaches at the sternum. And the clavicle also attaches at the scapula, but the scapula is not attached to the thoracic spine. It glides. So really, you're only anchored by the sternoclavicular joint. That's the joint between the sternum at the top and the clavicle. Interesting, huh? Okay, so here, this is what I was talking about. That's really where you're anchored. It's kind of bizarro. And this is the end. So this right here is your clavicle or collarbone. The collarbone is the most commonly fractured bone in the body. Your collarbone or clavicle is the most commonly fractured bone in the body, period, hands down. Sorry about the pun, because when you fall on your shoulder, like off a horse, you'll fracture it. Very common. Fall out of a bed. People tend to fracture the clavicle more than anything else in your body. So it's attached here at the sternum, and that's the sternoclavicular joint between the 2 of these. That's the clavicle. Here at the very end of the clavicle, you have a sternal border here, and you have the acromial border there. And this is looking through the ribs, because the ribs are actually superimposed. So this is actually on the back. The scapula would be behind the ribs. I don't know if the drawing is done very accurately. This should be more of a shadow, where the ribs should be like this, looking like this, right? All the way across. So the ribs should actually be showing this across, superimposing over the scapula. The scapula is behind. It's not attached to any bones back here. It's only attached where? At the acromial border of the clavicle, forming. This is the acromion process of the scapula. This is the acromial end, and it forms the acromioclavicular joint. Here's the upper arm. This is the humeral head coming into a socket. So next semester, when we do kinesiology, we get into a lot more about the joints and so on. And you can watch the videos on YouTube if you want. So the clavicles or collarbones, slender, doubly curved. They have like two curves lying across the superior thorax. The acromial or lateral end articulates with the scapula, and the sternal or medial end articulates with the sternum. They provide attachment points for numerous muscles and act as braces to hold the scapula and arms out laterally away from the body. Here's the clavicle. Here's a sternal border. This is an anterior view. You're looking at a right clavicle from the anterior view. This would be where the sternum would be, okay? And right at the top joint, there's a joint, and this is the sternal end of the clavicle right here. This is the acromial end of the clavicle here. It's going to articulate the acromion process of the scapula. So this is a right clavicle now, looking at it from underneath. And you see you have this conoid tubercle, very important. And you see kind of this ridge here for a muscle. There's muscles that attach right along here. The scapula or shoulder blades, that's your behind the ribs on your back, right? They are triangular shaped flat bones lying on the dorsal surface of the rib cage between the second and seventh ribs. The scapula have three borders and three angles. When they say borders, the side and inferior, lateral, medial, and superior borders. The major markings include the suprascapular notch, and that's for a nerve to pass through, the supraspinous and the infraspinous fossa, that's for muscles, and the spine of the scapula. And at the very end of the spine of the scapula, you come to the acromion like a diving board. And in the front, you have a coracoid process. Coracoid. Coracoid. Make sure you remember that. Okay, so here's that coracoid process right here. This is in the front, anteriorly sticking out. This is the acromion coming from the back. It's actually part of the spine of the scapula. You'll see in the next view. Here's the suprascapular notch for nerves to pass through. This is the superior border of the scapula. You can call that a superior angle. That's fine. I never asked that one. This is the medial border. This is the border that's going to be articulating with this would be the spine over here, right? And this is the medial border of a right scapula. This is an anterior aspect of a right scapula. You're looking at it from the front. Through the ribs would be on front of this, right here. So the ribs are removed. Everything's removed here, obviously. You have a medial border coming towards the spine. You have a lateral border, like going to your armpit area, right? And you have a superior border above and an inferior angle down here. So you can see two major things. You can see the acromion process coming forward from the back. And I say it's like a diving board. You'll see when we get into the lab. And this is the coracoid process in the front. And this is the glenoid cavity where the humeral head is going to fit in, right? Here's looking at the same scapula from the back. This is a right scapula. And if you're looking at it from a posterior aspect, that means this is what? Lateral or medial? This has got to be lateral. The arm will be coming up, and the humeral head would be fitting into the socket up here, right? You're looking at it from a posterior view. And so this is the inferior angle. There's the superior angle. Medial border where the spine would be over here, right? So that's medial border. Lateral border. Superior, inferior. Then you can still see a little bit of that suprascapular notch there. And you can see the superior angle. Now, you're hard to make this out, but this right here is called the spine of the scapula. It's coming right out at you. And the spine of the scapula is a great landmark. And I want you to mark this in your book right here. That's the root of the spine. I can't draw it. I can't write it. let's erase this for a second. There we go. Erase all these lines here for a minute. So what I'm trying to do is help you memorize something. It'll help you find things better. So, and it is an actual landmark, just not many books mark it. Right here is the root of the spine of the scapula, and this is the spine of the scapula. And when you come to the end, you meet this big process called the acromion process. I always try to say, if you're lost, that we don't know which process is which, whether this is the acromion or another one, you go to the root of the spine. You walk on the diving board, up the diving board, and you come to the end of the diving board, and you're on the acromion. A boing, a boing, a boing, a boing, and you dive into the pool, right? And then this is posterior. This kind of folds forward. And if you, when we see the next view, you see how this coracoid process is actually anterior. This is the lateral angle, this side. And if you came into this spot, that would be the glenoid cavity, which they're not marketing because you can't really see it too well. But so you have this great landmark, the spine of the scapula. The spine of the scapula has a supraspinous fossa, supraspinous fossa, and a infraspinous fossa. Now I want you to write down the names of the muscles of the rotator cuff. So you have this muscles called the rotator cuff, and the mnemonic to remember them is SITS, S-I-T-S. The first S I use for the supraspinatus muscle. That's above here, supraspinatus muscle. It goes all the way through, comes around and attaches to the humerus. The next one is the infraspinatus muscle, which is a big muscle, comes around and attaches and wraps around and attaches to the humerus. So those are two of them. Supraspinatus, that's S. I is infraspinatus, found in the infraspinous fossa. Supraspinatus found in the supraspinous fossa. And then our next one is going to be the subscapular or subscapularis, which is found in the subscapular fossa. So you're now looking at this right scapula, a complete lateral view from the side. You're looking directly from the side straight at it. This is the glenoid cavity. This is where the humeral head is going to fit in, the head of the upper arm. Here is that acromion process kind of coming forward a little bit, right? The boinga, 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 boinga diving board, right? And then anteriorly is the coracoid process. So you got two major processes here besides the spine. Now the spine of the scapula actually finalizes its location, or if you walked along the spine from the back, like we said, you would come to the end of the spine. You're actually on the acromion process. So how do you know the difference between the acromion and the coracoid? You go to the back, you look at it from the posterior view, and you find the root of the spine. You walk along the spine and come to the end, and that's acromion. The anterior one is the coracoid process. Now we have two, doesn't mark it here, there's another marking I want you to make sure you have. If you don't have it in your book, I want you to put it here. This is called the supraglenoid tubercle. See how this says infraglenoid tubercle down here? There is a supraglenoid tubercle right there. The supraglenoid tubercle forms an attachment for the long head of the biceps. And then the infraglenoid tubercle is an attachment point for the long head of the triceps. Okay? The subscapular fossa is underneath. That's for the subscapularis. The infraspinous fossa is for the infraspinatus. And you can't really see it, but the supraspinous fossa would be up here, and that is for the supraspinatus. So there's three of these muscles I just said, with three of the rotator cuff. You have supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscapularis is one of them, and the T is the teres minor. So write this down. The rotator cuff muscles, important in moving the shoulder and stabilizing your shoulder. As a matter of fact, the rotator cuff muscles are the most important thing to stabilize your shoulder. The shoulder is really stabilized mostly by the rotator cuff muscles. And we have a mnemonic to remember the rotator cuff muscles. It's SITS, or SITS. The first S is supraspinatus muscle, found in the supraspinous fossa. Infraspinatus muscle, found in the infraspinous fossa. The teres minor, you'll have to memorize that from the teres major, but the teres minor is the one in this mnemonic that is a rotator cuff muscle. And then the subscapularis is the fourth rotator cuff muscle. Now look, the rotator cuff is very important because it keeps the humeral head in the socket when you're moving your shoulder. And when you look at the rotator cuff muscles, you'll see that most of those muscles are wrapping, coming from the back to the front, from the back to the front, right? And the teres minor even comes from the back to the front. The subscapularis is going from the front to the humerus, a little different. So the upper limb consists of the arm or brachium, the forearm or antebrachium, and the hand or manus. There are 37 bones from the skeletal framework of each upper limb. The humerus is the sole bone of the arm. It articulates with the scapula at the shoulder and the radius and the ulnar at the elbow. The major markings of the upper arm or the arm are in the proximal humerus. It includes the head, anatomical and surgical necks, the greater and lesser tubercles, and the famous intertubercular groove, otherwise known as the bicipital groove. The distal humerus includes this weird spot where the bones kind of like capitulate on each other, called the capitulum. The trochlea, which means pulley, it's kind of looks like a pulley the way it's moving on there. And the medial and lateral epicondyles. And then you have the coronoid and the olecranon fossa. Notice this one's coronoid and not coracoid. The medial portion includes the radial groove and the deltoid process or tuberosity. So here's the humerus. Here's the top. Here's the bottom. This is an anterior view. And at the very top, you have the head of the humerus. Now you have this anatomical neck that kind of goes around on an angle. And then the surgical neck is usually just right here where they used to do surgery and replace the shoulder. They used to cut it there. Now this is anterior, right? And this one is posterior view. Let's focus on the anterior view first. And you see you have a greater tubercle. It's right here. It's higher up and it's a little bigger. So greater is higher, like a higher being. And tubercle means like a bump. Then you have your lesser tubercle, which is below. It just so happens it's more medial as well. So this is your lesser tubercle, greater tubercle right there. And in between is a space, like a little valley, and they call that the intertubercular sulcus, or sometimes it's called the bicipital groove because the long head of the biceps tendon passes through there. Now on the side, this is called the deltoid tuberosity. That's where the deltoid muscles will attach. The radial groove, I almost never ask that radial groove because some of the bones don't show it well. Now let's go distal on the anterior view. This is a little dicey. Okay, so if you're getting panicky when you look at this, don't panic. This is probably the worst of the extremities to try and learn, all right? So if you can learn this, you can learn anything. So we have the lateral side of the arm, right? This is an anterior view. It's a right arm. See, they even highlighted here, right? That's the right arm. And looking at it from the anterior view, so the deltoid comes in and attaches at the deltoid tuberosity. The long head of the biceps travels through that intertubercular groove. The head fits into the socket or the glenoid cavity of the scapula. This greater tubercle and lesser tubercle are sites for attachments for muscles. You come down, you have this lateral supracondylar ridge. That's where a very important muscle originates, called the brachioradialis. So you have this lateral supracondyle. So these are like condyles. A condyle is like a big articulation, like very big, broad articulation. So these condyles here have very special names. It's just not called the condyle of the humerus. And then you have fossa here for reception of the lower arm. As you bend your elbow, the bones of the elbow or the forearm have to fit into a spot here. So we have the radial bone laterally, so you have the radial fossa fitting in here. And then you have the ulnar fitting in, but on the anterior side is a process called the coronoid process, and that's going to fit into there, in the coronoid fossa. So you got a radial fossa laterally, coronoid fossa medially, and then these big condyles here. This one's called the capitulum. Think of Stonehenge, and you have two rocks kind of capitulating. It looks like it's going to fall. It's kind of just pivoting on there, sitting on there. Then this trochlea has a groove. It's hard to see it here. This groove allows for the ulnar to pivot on that. The trochlea notch of the ulnar pivots on the trochlea process, and it acts like a pulley system. When you look at the humerus from the back, you have a very significant marking right here, and that's called the olecranon fossa. The olecranon process is a big, that's your elbow. If you just take your elbow and bang it on the table, you know, like you're going to hit your funny bone almost, that's that big process of the ulnar bone. So you have the olecranon process will fit into the olecranon fossa when you straighten your elbow out. It's flat, right? So you have these big condyles, but then you have epicondyles. So you'll have a medial epicondyle, important to note because that's where all the flexors of the wrist start. And then you have a lateral epicondyle, and that's where all the extensors of the wrist start, believe it or not. Okay? And there is a medial epicondylar ridge, but it's not as important as the lateral epicondylar ridge. You can see the deltoid tuberosity again. Anatomical neck, surgical neck of the humerus, humeral head. You can see lesser tubercle, greater tubercle. Okay, I wish I could ask you questions, but I can't right now. We'll ask in the classroom. The bones of the forearm are the radius and the ulna. We just talked about those fossas. They articulate proximally with the humerus and distally with the wrist, or carpal bones. They also articulate with each other proximally and distally. So there's a joint at the top between the two of them as they pivot, especially when you pronate your forearm and supinate. So you have a proximal radial ulnar joint and a distal radial ulnar joint. And then there's this big broad membrane in between the two bones called the interosseous membrane, right? Here's that big interosseous membrane in between the two bones. So which one is the radius? You just look for the wheel. It looks like a little wheel, like a radial wheel. So this is the radius, and the radius is always lateral. Think about taking a radial pulse. You always take it on that thumb side. So you have a radius, and then you have the ulna. Now, here's another unique thing about this. This is the radial head up top, the one that looks like a wheel. And this is the ulnar head at the bottom. I'll repeat that. The ulnar head is down at the bottom here. So ulnar head is down at the bottom, but the radial head is at the top. Okay? And the radial head has the ability to roll or pivot on the ulna up here. So the radial head fits into the radial notch of the ulna. Distally, the ulnar head fits into the ulnar notch of the radius. So each one will have a notch for the other, and each one's head is going to fit into those notches. So now, this is anterior. The coronoid process, if you ever seen a tiara or a crown, it kind of comes up like that, right? I'm not very good at drawing, but this is the like a tiara, and so they call this the coronoid process. Let me erase it. So coronoid process is right here, and it kind of looks like a crown. And that's the one that's going to fit into the coronoid fossa of the humerus. When you flex your elbow, it has to fit into a spot, just like the radial head has to fit into the radial fossa. That's anteriorly. Then what we see here, this trochlea notch. The trochlea notch is going to pivot like a pulley around it's like a belt wrapping around a pulley, and that's the trochlea notch is going to pivot around the trochlea of the humerus. And then on the very back, this is your elbow, right? The olecranon process. If you banged your elbow, that's what you're banging here, the olecranon process. Distally, remember, this is not the head of the radius, but it does have a styloid process of the radius, that pointy thing. And then there's a styloid process of the ulna, which is coming off the head of the ulna. Remember, that's the head of the ulna. And there's a joint there called the distal radial ulnar joint. And the head of the ulna is fitting into the ulnar notch of the radius. Here it's showing you that Colles fracture we talked about, the distal radius. That would be a fracture right through there. The ulna lies medially in the forearm and is slightly longer than the radius. It forms the major portion of the elbow joint with the humerus. Its major markings include the olecranon, as I called it, the olecranon process. The coronoid process, we saw that tiara, crown. The trochlea notch, that's going to pivot on the trochlea of the humerus. The radial notch, that's going to receive the radius of the head of the radius proximally. And then distally, there's a styloid process. The radius lies opposite or lateral to the ulna and is thin at its proximal end and widened distally. The superior surface of the head articulates with the capitulum of the humerus. This becomes very clear in the lab. Immediately, the head articulates with the radial notch of the ulna. The major markings include the radial tuberosity, which is an attachment for the biceps muscle, the ulnar notch, and the styloid process. So the radial tuberosity is right there. There's the radial tuberosity. You know, when I do a deep tendon reflex, I look for that. Okay, so you can review this. I'm going to upload the regular PowerPoint besides this one as well. This is the hand. It's showing you the wrist and the hand together. So the wrist bones, there's 8, 2 rows of 4. And then you have, so the wrist bones are called the carpal bones, a total of 8. It's 2 rows of 4. There's a proximal row and a distal row. And then these are the metacarpals 1 through 5. So these are the carpals, 8 of them, 5 metacarpals. And then you have the phalanges. Now the thumb only has 2 phalanges, whereas the other fingers have 1, 2, 3 phalanges each, right? So there's 8 bones in the carpal, and we name them from proximal row first, and we name them from lateral to medial. So the first one is right under, remember the first day of classes, I had you guys do the anatomical snuff box, remember that? You know, you bring your thumb, abduct your thumb and extend your thumb, and you look at that little spot that the old Whigs in England used to sniff stuff in there, that anatomical snuff box. Right underneath there is the scaphoid. Another name for the scaphoid is also used as the navicula. Scaphoid and navicula sometimes in the past have been used interchangeably, those names. So there's a mnemonic to learn these. And it's kind of a silly mnemonic. And using navicula instead of scaphoid. So I'm going to give you the mnemonic. It's a very silly mnemonic. All right, please, I did not make this up, but it's easy for me to remember because it's so silly. So imagine this is navicula, right? So N-L-T-P for the first one. Never lower Tilly's pants, right? Or Tom's pants. Never lower Tom's or Tilly's pants. T, trying to caress her or him. Silly, right? There's other mnemonics, but I never remembered it. This one somehow I just can't forget it. So the first one is the scaphoid bone. This is the proximal row. This is the distal row. So the first row you come to as you go down the arm would be 4 bones. That would be navicular or scaphoid. Right underneath the anatomical stuff box would be scaphoid. The next one over towards the medial side is the lunate. It's like a half-shaped moon. The triquetral has like it's kind of like looks like a diamond shape almost. And then the pisiform looks like a little pea. It's a tiny little bone. Then you go back to the lateral side, and the trapeze is hanging off the trapezoid. That's how I remember it. So the trapezium is more lateral, and then the next bone is like the trapezoid holding it, like a frame for it. So imagine a trapeze hanging off a trapezoid. And then the next one in the middle is the big capitate. It's right down the middle. The biggest bone in the wrist. It lines up right with your middle finger. And then the hamate has like a little hook. If you looked at it ventrally or anteriorly or on the volar surface, it has like a hook of the hamate. And we'll look at all this. Don't worry if it's like very hard for you to follow. If you have the book open when you look at these notes and you look at it as I say it, it's a lot easier. If you have a hand in your hand, you know, an actual bones, it's easier than that. So the metacarpals or metacarpus, those are the 5 bones of the hand before you get to the fingers. So it's after the carpal bones, then you have the metacarpals. And the number 1 is always named on the thumb side. Number 5 is always named on the pinky side. So at the base, it's articulating with the carpal bones proximally and with each other medially and laterally. And then at the top, the very end of those bones, the heads articulate with the phalanges. And then the phalanges, each hand contains 14 miniature tiny bones called phalanges. The fingers or digits are numbered 1 through 5, beginning with the thumb is also called pollex, or number 1. Each finger except the thumb has 3 phalanges, a proximal, middle, and a distal phalange. And the thumb has no middle phalanx, just a proximal and a distal.